1. The Antonine Plague. At the zenith of its power, the Roman Empire was a colossal force, spanning over 5 million square kilometers, with a population exceeding 70 million people. Yet, this seemingly unstoppable empire faced a harrowing challenge that neither legions nor emperors could overcome: the Antonine Plague. This deadly epidemic swept through the empire from 165 to 180 AD, leaving a staggering death toll of over 5 million. Some regions lost as much as a third of their population, permanently altering the empire's trajectory. The plague's origins trace back to Roman soldiers returning from campaigns in the Near East. Historians believe the disease, likely smallpox or measles, emerged in Mesopotamia and traveled west along the empire's intricate trade and military networks. These networks, which were vital for maintaining Rome's strength, became the pathways of death. Cities like Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria, centers of commerce and culture, became epicenters of infection. To visualize its scale, imagine a world where 2,000 people die every day in Rome alone. In certain regions, agricultural production collapsed as fields lay untended, leading to food shortages and inflation. The Antonine Plague was as horrifying in its symptoms as it was in its spread. Victims endured relentless fevers, excruciating abdominal pain, and severe diarrhea. The most distinct feature was a pustular rash that covered the body, leaving disfiguring scars on those who survived. Mortality rates were estimated between 10% and 30%, with some densely populated areas experiencing even higher death rates. Modern estimates suggest that up to 25% of the empire's population perished during the plague's 2-decade reign of terror. For the Roman military, the plague was catastrophic. By the late 160s AD, entire legions were reportedly decimated, leaving the empire vulnerable. The inability to replenish ranks led to gaps in border defenses, particularly against aggressive Germanic tribes. In fact, some historians argue that the weakening of the Roman army during this period set the stage for the Marcomannic Wars, as external enemies seized the opportunity to strike a debilitated empire. Recruitment was not the only issue. The empire's tax revenues plummeted as workers and taxpayers succumbed to the disease. Roads that once carried goods and soldiers now became avenues for the plague's relentless spread. This economic toll forced the empire into a precarious state, with Emperor Marcus Aurelius scrambling to maintain stability. He was said to have witnessed the devastation, writing extensively in his Meditations about human mortality and the fragility of power. Religious shifts also began to take shape. Pagan priests interpreted the plague as divine punishment for the empire's moral decay, while emerging Christian communities offered a message of hope and salvation. Many scholars believe this period marked the acceleration of Christianity's spread within the empire, as its focus on charity and care for the afflicted contrasted sharply with the fear-driven responses of traditional Roman institutions. Some historians argue that the Antonine Plague marks the beginning of the Roman Empire's slow decline, a turning point where its vulnerabilities were laid bare. Culturally, the Antonine Plague forced a reckoning. Public health measures, rudimentary as they were, began to take shape. Ancient texts suggest that burial practices were adjusted to minimize the risk of further outbreaks. Galen, the famed Roman physician, documented the plague extensively, though even his observations were limited by the medical knowledge of the time. His writings, however, provided a foundation for future understandings of infectious diseases. The Antonine Plague is more than a historical event. It is a case study in the fragility of even the most advanced societies. It demonstrated how interconnectedness, Rome's greatest strength, could also be its greatest weakness in the face of a pandemic. It is a chilling reminder that no empire, no matter how powerful, is immune to the forces of nature. Yet this was not the only time humanity would face such devastation. Barely 400 years later, another plague would descend upon the Byzantine Empire, wreaking even greater havoc. This plague would kill tens of millions, reshape Europe's future, and leave its mark on history. Join us as we uncover the story of a pandemic that dwarfed even the Antonine Plague in its deadly scope. 2. Plague of Justinian. Byzantium, the heart of the Roman Empire's eastern legacy, was a jewel of the ancient world. Its capital, Constantinople, stood as a beacon of wealth, culture, and military power, But in 541 AD, the empire faced a devastating enemy that even its formidable walls could not repel: the plague of Justinian. This pandemic, considered by many to be the first recorded instance of bubonic plague, ravaged the Byzantine Empire and killed an estimated 25 to 50 million people, or nearly half the world's population at the time. The plague is believed to have originated in Central Asia before spreading through trade routes to Egypt and the Mediterranean. Constantinople, a major hub for trade, became the epicenter of the outbreak in 541 AD. Grain shipments from Egypt, a lifeline for the Byzantine Empire, carried not just food but also fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. The population density of Constantinople proved fatal. At the height of the outbreak, the city was losing an estimated 5,000 to 10,000 people per day. Procopius, a Byzantine historian, vividly described streets littered with corpses and a city so overwhelmed by death that bodies were left unburied, floating in the harbors or heaped in mass graves outside the city walls. The disease struck with terrifying speed. Victims initially suffered from fever, chills, and swollen lymph nodes, commonly known as buboes. These blackened, painful swellings, often appearing in the groin or armpits, were a hallmark of the bubonic plague. Without modern medicine, survival rates were grim, and death often came within days of infection. In some cases, septicemic or pneumonic forms of the plague emerged, spreading even more rapidly and ensuring a near-certain death for the infected. Procopius described the symptoms in haunting detail, emphasizing the unpredictability of who would survive and who would succumb. Entire families were wiped out, leaving homes abandoned and entire neighborhoods desolate. Constantinople, a city reliant on trade and agriculture, found its supply chains severed. The plague decimated the empire's workforce, leading to widespread famine and inflation. Emperor Justinian I himself contracted the plague but survived, though weakened both physically and politically. To maintain control, Justinian implemented emergency measures, including attempts to fix food prices and requisition supplies. However, these efforts were largely ineffective in the face of such catastrophic losses. The empire's military campaigns, including Justinian's ambitious plan to reclaim the Western Roman territories, faltered as soldiers fell victim to the disease. The plague weakened the Byzantine Empire's ability to fend off external threats, particularly from the Persians and the emerging threat of Slavic tribes to the north. The plague of Justinian didn't just devastate Byzantium, it had ripple effects across the globe. Some historians argue that the pandemic accelerated the decline of the Western Roman Empire by destabilizing trade networks and weakening Mediterranean economies. It may have also indirectly paved the way for the rise of Islam, as the Byzantine and Sasanian empires, both severely weakened by the plague, struggled to maintain control over their territories. The sheer mortality of the plague led to profound social changes. Labor shortages gave surviving workers newfound leverage, gradually undermining the feudal-like systems that dominated Byzantine society. Some communities turned to religion for solace, interpreting the plague as divine punishment. This period saw an increase in apocalyptic beliefs, with many convinced they were living in the end times. Unlike many plagues before it, the plague of Justinian left behind detailed historical records. Procopius, in particular, documented the pandemic with remarkable clarity, allowing modern researchers to better understand its origins and impacts. DNA analysis of skeletal remains from this period has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis, providing critical evidence of its role in history's first recorded pandemic. The Byzantine government's responses, though limited in effectiveness, laid the groundwork for early public health measures. Efforts to isolate infected individuals, dispose of bodies, and control trade were primitive, but represented a growing awareness of the importance of containment during outbreaks. By 542 AD, the worst of the plague had subsided, but its effects lingered for decades. The Byzantine Empire, though resilient, never fully recovered from the blow. Population declines meant fewer soldiers, taxpayers, and workers, leaving the empire vulnerable to internal strife and external threats. Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire was effectively shattered, as resources had to be redirected to simply maintain stability within the empire's borders. Despite its devastation, the plague of Justinian remains a pivotal moment in history. It exposed the fragility of even the most powerful civilizations, underscoring the interconnectedness of empires and the vulnerabilities that come with it. But this was not the last time humanity would grapple with such a devastating pandemic. Next, another forgotten plague would erupt in the heart of Imperial Russia, sparking chaos, riots, and a deadly struggle for survival. 3. The 1771 Russian Plague. Moscow in 1771 was a city of chaos, gripped by panic, violence, and death. The 1771 Russian plague outbreak became one of the most devastating pandemics in Russian history, claiming an estimated 50,000 lives, a staggering toll given the city's population of roughly 250,000 at the time. This was no ordinary epidemic. It transformed Moscow into a dystopian landscape of deserted streets, raging riots, and mass graves. The origins of the 1771 outbreak can be traced to the ongoing Russo-Turkish War, 1768 to 1774, where infected soldiers and contaminated supplies spread the disease. Moscow, the empire's political and religious heart, was particularly vulnerable due to its dense population and lack of modern sanitation. The first cases were reported in the late spring of 1771, but it wasn't until the summer that the situation spiraled out of control. Initial attempts by authorities to contain the outbreak through isolation wards and limited quarantines proved inadequate. By August, thousands were falling ill every week, and the city's infrastructure began to collapse. The plague, likely a form of bubonic or pneumonic plague, exhibited terrifying symptoms. Victims suffered from high fevers, painful swollen lymph nodes, and gangrene-like blackened extremities. In many cases, death occurred within days, leaving no time for effective treatment. With no understanding of germ theory and limited medical knowledge, physicians could do little more than prescribe bleeding or herbal remedies, which were largely ineffective. The disease's spread was exacerbated by Moscow's cramped living conditions and unhygienic practices. Garbage piled high in the streets, water supplies were contaminated, and funerals could not keep pace with the mounting death toll. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned as residents fled to the countryside, inadvertently spreading the disease further. By September 1771, the people of Moscow had reached their breaking point. Quarantines were tightened, restricting movement in and out of the city. Authorities ordered the confiscation and destruction of personal belongings from infected households, including clothing, bedding, and furniture. These measures, though aimed at halting the spread, fueled widespread anger. The breaking point came when Archbishop Ambrosius of Moscow ordered the removal of the revered Our Lady of Bogolyubovo icon, which many believed could protect the city. The public saw this as an act of sacrilege, igniting the infamous plague riot of 1771. Only after the military intervened was order restored, but by then, the riots had claimed hundreds of lives in addition to those lost to the plague. Empress Catherine the Great, ruling from St. Petersburg, faced a monumental challenge in managing the outbreak. She dispatched military units to enforce martial law in Moscow and appointed Grigory Orlov, a trusted advisor, to oversee the city's recovery efforts. Orlov implemented stricter quarantine measures, established field hospitals, and ordered mass burials outside the city to reduce contamination. Despite these measures, public trust in the government remained low. Many viewed the authorities' actions as heavy-handed and insensitive. Mass graves, hastily dug in areas like the Vagankovo Cemetery, became symbols of despair and death. Economically, the plague devastated Moscow. Commerce ground to a halt. Artisans and traders abandoned their work, and the city faced food shortages, as rural suppliers feared bringing goods into the infected capital. Estimates suggest that Moscow lost up to 20% of its population, leaving a vacuum that would take years to recover from. The 1771 Russian plague left an indelible mark on the empire. In the years following the outbreak, Russia began implementing sanitation measures in urban areas, including waste management and the establishment of public health offices. The epidemic also served as a wake-up call for medical advancements. While germ theory was still decades away, the outbreak inspired greater investment in medical training and facilities. Catherine herself promoted vaccination programs in subsequent years. recognizing the potential of scientific solutions to combat disease. The once vibrant city had become a graveyard of memories, its streets haunted by the echoes of riots and mourning. But even amid the devastation, Moscow rebuilt. The city's resilience in the face of one of its darkest chapters set the stage for future reforms that would shape its role as a cornerstone of the Russian Empire. Still, the 1771 Russian plague remains a stark reminder of how quickly disease can unravel the fabric of society, turning fear into chaos and revealing the fragility of human institutions. It was a pandemic that transformed a city and its people forever. Yet, as devastating as this epidemic was, it pales in comparison to the next pandemics that would sweep the world in the following century. One of the deadliest waves that shook cities from London to India would claim millions of lives and redefine global health responses. The third cholera pandemic. The 19th century was a time of rapid industrialization and urbanization, but with these advancements came a deadly consequence. Overcrowded cities and poor sanitation created the perfect conditions for cholera. The third cholera pandemic, spanning from 1846 to 1860, became the deadliest of the 7 recorded cholera pandemics. It claimed more than 1 million lives worldwide and fundamentally changed the way public health crises were managed. Unlike earlier pandemics, the third cholera pandemic was truly global in its reach. Originating in the Ganges River delta of India, where cholera had long been endemic, the disease spread along burgeoning trade routes to Europe, the Americas, and beyond. By the mid-19th century, faster modes of transportation, such as steamships and railroads, enabled cholera to traverse continents in weeks rather than years. London, Paris, New York, and Bombay became hotspots of infection, with thousands falling ill within weeks of the disease's arrival. In Britain alone, cholera claimed over 50,000 lives in 1854, decimating communities already weakened by poverty and poor sanitation. Cholera is a waterborne illness caused by the bacterium Vibrio cholera, which spreads through contaminated water and food. Its symptoms are sudden and brutal: profuse watery diarrhea, vomiting, and rapid dehydration. Victims could lose up to 10 liters of fluid per day, leading to sunken eyes, shriveled skin, and severe muscle cramps. Without treatment, death often occurred within hours, with mortality rates reaching 50% in untreated cases. The disease disproportionately affected the poor, who lacked access to clean water and lived in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. Urban slums became death traps, while wealthier areas remained relatively unscathed. A stark reminder of the inequality that shaped public health outcomes. In 1854, during one of the deadliest outbreaks in London, a physician named Dr. John Snow made a groundbreaking discovery that would change the course of medical history. At the time, the dominant theory was that cholera spread through miasma or bad air. Snow, however, hypothesized that the disease was waterborne. To prove his theory, Snow conducted a meticulous investigation in the Soho neighborhood of London, mapping cases of cholera and identifying a contaminated water pump on Broad Street as the source. By persuading authorities to remove the pump handle, Snow effectively ended the outbreak in that area, saving countless lives. This investigation marked the birth of modern epidemiology, the study of how diseases spread, and demonstrated the importance of data and observation in combating epidemics. The third cholera pandemic served as a catalyst for major public health initiatives. Governments around the world began to recognize the critical role of clean water and sanitation in preventing disease. In Britain, the cholera outbreak spurred the construction of modern sewer systems, such as the London Sewer Network, designed by engineer Joseph Bazalgette. These systems drastically reduced the incidence of waterborne illnesses in urban areas. The lessons learned during the third cholera pandemic paved the way for advances in sanitation that saved millions of lives in the decades to come. By the time the pandemic ended in 1860, cholera had claimed over 1 million lives, with India bearing the brunt of the deaths, estimated at over 600,000 fatalities. The economic impact was severe. Businesses shuttered, and governments spent vast sums on quarantine efforts, medical supplies, and public works projects. Cholera's ability to paralyze entire cities underscored the need for coordinated international responses to pandemics. a concept that would later give rise to organizations like the World Health Organization, WHO. The third cholera pandemic also sparked scientific advancements. While an effective vaccine wouldn't be developed until the late 19th century, the pandemic inspired researchers to better understand the bacterium responsible for the disease. In 1854, Italian anatomist Filippo Pacini first identified Vibrio cholera, though his findings were largely ignored at the time. It wasn't until the work of German scientist Robert Koch decades later that the bacterium was universally recognized as the cause of cholera. These discoveries laid the groundwork for future vaccines and treatments. The third cholera pandemic was a watershed moment in the history of public health. It highlighted the importance of scientific inquiry, infrastructure, and equitable access to resources. But cholera is far from a relic of the past. In modern times, outbreaks continue to claim lives, particularly in vulnerable regions such as Yemen and Haiti. The lessons of the third cholera pandemic remain painfully relevant, reminding us that access to clean water is not just a necessity, but a fundamental human right. As the pandemic subsided, the world believed it had seen the worst. Yet, in 1910, another forgotten plague emerged in the frigid lands of Northeast Asia, threatening to spread across continents. The pneumonic pandemic would soon test the limits of human resilience and international cooperation. Final chapter: the Manchurian Plague. The frigid landscapes of Northeast Asia in the early 20th century bore witness to one of the most lethal outbreaks of pneumonic plague in human history. The Manchurian Plague, spanning from 1910 to 1911, killed over 60,000 people in less than a year. This outbreak not only devastated local populations, but also became a turning point in global efforts to combat infectious diseases. The Manchurian Plague is believed to have originated in marmots, rodents native to the region, whose fur was highly prized in the international trade. Marmots infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague, passed the disease to humans, where it mutated into its most deadly form, pneumonic plague. Unlike the bubonic variant, which spreads through flea bites, pneumonic plague is airborne and transmitted directly between humans through respiratory droplets. The disease first appeared among workers on the Chinese Eastern Railway, a network connecting Russia to northern China. These laborers, often living in crowded and unsanitary conditions, provided fertile ground for the plague to spread rapidly. By the end of 1910, the epidemic had reached the bustling trade hub of Harbin, a city with a population of over 100,000. The pneumonic plague is the most aggressive form of plague, with a nearly 100% fatality rate if untreated. Victims experienced sudden high fevers, intense chest pain, coughing up blood, and severe respiratory distress. Death typically occurred within 24 to 72 hours after the onset of symptoms, leaving little time for medical intervention. The disease's rapid progression and airborne nature made it exceptionally difficult to control. In Harbin, entire households were wiped out within days, and hospitals quickly became overwhelmed. Physicians lacked effective treatments, relying instead on isolation and rudimentary care. Dr. Wu Linte, a Cambridge-educated physician, was appointed to lead the response. He is often credited as the first Chinese epidemiologist, and his innovative strategies during the Manchurian Plague earned him international recognition. Dr. Wu introduced the use of cloth face masks, which he designed to cover both the mouth and nose, effectively reducing airborne transmission. This marked one of the earliest recorded uses of face masks in controlling infectious disease outbreaks. He also implemented strict quarantine measures, closed public gathering spaces, and ordered the immediate cremation of plague victims to prevent further spread. However, Wu's decisive leadership, backed by government support, helped prevent the disease from spreading beyond Northeast Asia. In response to the crisis, China hosted the International Plague Conference in 1911 in Mukden, now Shenyang, bringing together 23 nations to discuss strategies for combating infectious diseases. This conference marked a milestone in global health cooperation, laying the groundwork for future international collaborations, including the eventual establishment of the World Health Organization, WHO. Dr. Wu presented his findings at the conference, advocating for the widespread adoption of face masks, improved sanitation, and standardized quarantine protocols. His work not only contained the Manchurian plague, but also set a precedent for modern approaches to managing epidemics. Yet, the crisis also highlighted the importance of coordinated responses and the role of science in combating pandemics. The Manchurian plague demonstrated the devastating potential of airborne diseases and the critical importance of early containment. Dr. Wu's innovative use of masks and his emphasis on rapid response became foundational principles in epidemic management. His work continues to influence public health policies to this day. Though the Manchurian plague was contained within a year, its legacy endures. It serves as a reminder of humanity's vulnerability to infectious diseases and the resilience required to combat them. These forgotten pandemics may seem like distant tragedies, but their stories hold critical insights for the modern world. History is a tapestry woven with triumphs and tragedies, and the stories of these 5 forgotten plagues reveal humanity's eternal struggle against disease. These plagues were not merely events of their time. They were pivotal moments that forced societies to adapt and innovate. Modern epidemiology, sanitation systems, and global health organizations owe their origins to the lessons learned from these devastating outbreaks. Yet the question remains, have we truly learned enough? Today, in an era of globalization, climate change, and rapid urbanization, the risks of pandemics are ever present. The challenges faced by our ancestors resonate deeply in our own time. With advances in science and technology, we are better equipped than ever to combat disease. But are we prepared to address the inequities, mistrust, and disinformation that often accompany public health crises? As you reflect on these forgotten pandemics, consider this. Will future generations look back on our time and see it as one of resilience and progress, or one where the same lessons had to be painfully relearned? Thank you for watching and exploring this vital piece of forgotten history. If you found these stories fascinating, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss more content that brings history's most incredible stories to life. Thank you. See you next video.